Hello. You'll notice in the past that we have done a number of little videos called How My Body Works. And today we're going to do that again, but in a slightly different fashion. Previously we've just talked about the mechanical aspects, the bones and the joints and what have you. Today we're going to look at something sort of a bit more internal, to do with what we call our physiology. And if you're not aware, physiology means sort of all the things that work biochemically and what have you, how hormones interact with other things and what have you. So we're not going to go into sort of immense detail, but I think there's one thing, excuse me, there's one thing that is always confusing, and we hear about it quite a lot. So we're going to talk today about inflammation. And the question really, that many of us who don't know much about it, and that can be even myself, can conclude is inflammation a good thing or a bad thing? Because we hear about inflammatory responses to injury, we hear about anti-inflammatory medication, and therefore we presume, because I think it's something like 96% of all prescriptions given for people over the age of 65 are for non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. So you'd think inflammation was something that the body doesn't like. But, and a gentleman called Ruslan Medsidov, who is a professor of immunology at Stirling University, said, "We still think in terms of normal physiology and abnormal inflammation. However, inflammation is as central to the understanding of physiology as hormones." And from his standpoint, and this was written in 2020, so only 4.5 to 5 years ago, he stated that even though they are studying it for a long time, they only understand about 10% of how inflammation works. Personally, I find that quite interesting, because when I was at college, and I graduated in 2001, when I remember physiology lectures telling us of how important inflammation is. And inflammation actually protects as well as harms the body. Inflammation is part of the immune system. But as we know, the immune system can be a bit of a double-edged sword. Some things seem to protect you, and some things seem to harm you. And I think it's in part, like many things in life, it depends on the volume, if you like, or the scale of things. There are lots of things that we can think about that we can have or drink or use in a certain small scale and does no harm to us. But if we do it to excess, then it can be harmful. For instance, one thing that is sort of stated that, and is known, that inflammation is a bit of a culprit of the problem are autoimmune diseases. So diseases like multiple sclerosis and the other autoimmune diseases, which can also be called as inflammatory arthritis. And those include rheumatoid arthritis, systemic lupus, gout, pseudo-gout, ankylosing spondylosis, osteomyelitis, and psoriatic arthritis. So in all those situations, there will be, in the inflammatory arthritis, in the autoimmune diseases, basically what's happening is that for some reason, the body decides that there's a part of it doesn't like, and then it sort of attacks itself. And the inflammatory response is part of the issue, because inflammation has a number of different roles. It is part of the immune system, as you say, and it's done to fight things off. It's part of the system that looks for viruses and looks for bacteria, and then along with things like cytokines. And cytokines are sort of the early warning system that's looking for problems, and there's an increase in number of cytokines will increase the creation of inflammation, and then they, together with T cells and white cells and many other cells, come and have a look at and attack the outside agent, let's say, the virus or bacteria. But in addition, inflammation tidies up what they call molecular messes, so it's a bit like a cleaner around the system, really. It does in young children. It prunes excess neurons in the brain, and therefore is an essential part of brain development. It's to do with regulating the function of many organs, including the liver and the intestines. But in doing so, it would appear that it leaves a little bit of residual inflammation behind. And we mentioned about cytokines, which go in hand with inflammation. And so they're very small proteins, and they sort of trigger inflammation. But in addition to fighting disease, they also help to regulate the nervous system in relation to synaptic connections, so sort of connections between nerves and nerve endings, and they also stimulate fluid absorption and certain other forms. Now, of course, one of the negative effects of too much inflammation, which can be brought on and cause certain what we call lifestyle diseases like heart disease and diabetes and obesity, and sort of it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. Once your body has got to a certain state and there has been a reactive effect as a consequence of that state, i.e. there's an inflammatory response, then the overt inflammatory response can actually facilitate or create a worsening of the problem. Now, of course, as we've said, therefore there are many situations, and if you have an injury and oftentimes you go to the doctor, you may well be, or most probably will be prescribed with what we call non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs we call them. And it's strangely to say how many they're sold. In 2023, $130 billion was spent on NSAIDs, anti-inflammatories. And it's predicted that by 2033, so what's that, 8 years from now, or 10 years from when they made this assessment, so in 2033, $272 billion will be spent on NSAIDs. But of course, so when it's talking about NSAIDs, there are a multiplicity of them, but the most common ones you'll have heard of are aspirin, ibuprofen, naproxen, diclofenac, and celecoxib. Some of them have been withdrawn because of certain effects, but of course, like all medication, there is potential for side effects. And the side effects of NSAIDs are, if they're gastrointestinal, it can be what we call dyspepsia, which you would know is indigestion and discomfort in the upper abdomen, so tummy ache basically. Gastroduodenal ulcers, so irritations in the lining of part of the gastric system, part of your gut system. They can cause bleeding in your gut. In relation to the heart, NSAIDs can cause edema, which is basically excess of watery fluid in the cavities or tissues of the body. They can cause hypertension, which you will know is sort of where the blood pressure is too high. Can cause congestive heart failure, effectively where the heart doesn't pump as well as it should do. Can cause myocardial infarction, which was better known as heart attacks. And it can also cause strokes and other thrombotic events. So basically where blood stops flowing to part of the brain. Other things that can happen, NSAIDs can cause electrolyte imbalance. So you get too much or too little of certain minerals in the body. You can get sodium retention. So again, that's a sort of salt imbalance predominantly, which will affect, amongst other things, how your kidneys work. So, as I say, inflammation, if we didn't have inflammation, ostensibly we'd die. So inflammation is a very, very useful, necessary molecule firing around our blood system all the time. and it is used, when used appropriately by the body, it has a very, very positive healing effect. But it is clear that because of the interaction with many, many other molecules within the body, the regulation of the inflammation can, on occasion, go into overdrive. And then, rather than being a healing agent and a repairing agent and a very necessary agent for our health, it can, as we've said with some of the anti-inflammatory, the autoimmune diseases and the inflammatory arthritis, it can be part of the problem. So I hope that provides a little bit of clarification as to why sometimes you hear that, inflammation's bad, but in actual fact, in essence, it's an important part of the immune system. And in essence, it is very necessary for our daily health and daily repair. It goes around repairing very, very small damaged tissues all the time. But too much of it, too intense, and too much density of it, let's say, overworking, its reaction can go sky high, and then it can be a part of a problem. And therefore it can facilitate or regenerate or even almost create certain disease problems for the body. Okay, we'll do another one soon. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.